the newsagents.
We've been very clear that the situation now is that China is behaving in an increasingly assertive way abroad, authoritarian at home, and it represents an epoch-defining challenge and also the greatest state-based threat to our economic security. So it's right that we take measures to protect ourselves, which is what...
That is Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, trying to work out this balance between taking the money that Chinese trade offers this country and knowing when to say no. Because last night they revealed British targets that were part of a wide campaign of Chinese cyber attacks. The UK, the US, other countries jointly announced that China had been targeting political dissidents, politicians, candidates, companies, journalists, academics, you name it. 10,000 malicious emails, and in the process gained access to the accounts and telephone records of millions and millions of citizens in the West. So how should we deal with this threat and with this trading partner? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And China. Be scared, be very scared. Is it a national security threat? These are things that we have been hearing for some time. And there was the whole row over Huawei and what role it should play in rolling out the 5G network, because there were suggestions that would impinge national security. But yesterday there seemed to be a concerted move, not just by the British government, but by other governments, the US as well.
New Zealand as well.
And about the threat that China poses to national security through its tapping of phones, which sounds very old-fashioned, but digital interference and hacking and whatever else it happens to be.
Yeah, I mean, they accused Beijing, essentially, of a prolific campaign, a global campaign, which was seizing the personal information of, amongst others, academics, journalists and politicians. We think about 45 of our MPs were, do we say hacked or digitally
their digital security was compromised.
Right, OK. And I guess what we've heard in the last 24 hours from the government, Oliver Dowden, and today Rishi Sunak, is that the government is now preparing to place China on what they call an enhanced list of countries that pose the biggest national security risk to the UK. Now, this will not come as big news to anyone sort of thinking, it's not France, it's not the Netherlands. We kind of knew that China wasn't always looking at things in our best interests. And I guess enhance is one of those slightly euphemistic words where you're kind of saying, what does that mean? Does that mean you stop trading with them? Does that mean that you ban TikTok? Does that mean that you want to have nothing to do with China? Or does it just mean you kind of go, ooh, better be careful? So ministers have been out on the morning round, I guess trying to work out what they think about this and what they're trying to tell the public. And Gillian Keegan was asked by our own Nick Ferrari on LBC whether China was friend or foe. Have a listen.
Oh, well, I mean, China's a very complex situation. I don't think it's really easy to bring it down to just two words. Obviously, we have the best security and intelligence services in the world. We work very closely with other
How have they been able to hack 40
nations.
million people voters' records if we're that tight then?
Well, of course, we will always be under threat from cyber attacks. And one of the big things I think that, and the National Cyber Security Centre obviously is focused on this every day, and the intelligence services are increasingly focused on this as well, is, as we are more and more online, there is definitely increased threats from cyber security. And that is a constant threat. We need to always individually keep on top of it as well,
you've said
as
that word threat.
systems.
You've said that word threat twice, so you will agree then that China needs to be declared a threat to national security?
Well, what we've always said is that we
sorry,
are aware...
I just want to clarify that. You've said threat twice, so we can declare them as a threat to national security. You will concur with that?
I don't want you to put words in my mouth. What we know is that
So here she is trying to work out how she says that China is not a threat when it clearly is a threat, but also how she says it is a threat when we do so much trade with that country. And what she went on to say on GB News was clearly starting some sort of trade issue is what we want to avoid. Beijing is a large trading partner.
The message is China, please stop this. We're very, very cross about it. We're going to sanction one or two people and one or two companies for naughtiness, but we're not going to start a trade war because we can't afford to, even whether it's the United States of America. And you look at the trade flows between the US and China, and they are still absolutely enormous. It would be the most major disruption to the global economy were the UK and the US and the EU to start declaring a kind of trade war with China, because the world economy will sink if that happens.
Yeah, to be fair, this is not just a problem for the Conservative government. It's a massive issue for Labour if it gets in after the next election. And it's an issue, I feel like I've been covering it for 30 years. You know, I was in Hong Kong in the early 90s when we were having exactly this discussion about trade versus human rights 3 years after Tiananmen Square, after a massacre. So I don't think this ever goes away. But what you constantly see is politicians trying to grapple with what they think of as the human rights response or the security response, the national security response, versus the place that we'll be in if we just stop trading.
Well, let's speak to Bob Seeley now. He is the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight, and he's also a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Well, joining us now, Bob Seeley. Bob, what does it mean that China is going to be on this enhanced list? This was the announcement by the government last night, and I'm sort of struggling to work out what the implications of that are.
Okay, I think there is a journey that we are going on and other Western nations are going on in our relationship with China. And I don't think we're at that destination yet. And I think we are going to end up, sadly, seeing China more as a threat than a partner. And for me, the important thing is the practical outcome of this. And although we are making strides, I think for me, the important thing is that we understand the incredible breadth of the number of issues we have to cover in order to develop a coherent policy towards China. And a lot of that is just making our defenses against authoritarianism and domination of supply lines better. So this is not about attacking other people or necessarily criticizing other people, but it's about ensuring that we're doing more to defend our democracy, but also our economic supply lines, etc.
Your colleague, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan's warned Britain against overreacting.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. We shouldn't be overreacting, but it depends how you define overreacting, and it depends how you define where we are now. I think Gillian's a great Secretary of State for Education, but for me, the issue is ensuring a really robust approach to China. And one of the things that concerns me, for example, with Confucius Institutes, should we be kicking Confucius Institutes out? Well, not necessarily, but if they continue to be a front for monitoring Chinese students in this country, that's not acceptable. If they continue to be a front for monitoring Hong Kong students in this country and keeping tabs on them, that's not acceptable. If Confucius Institutes are effectively propagandizing for the Communist Party, that's not acceptable.
Well, can I just break that down? In terms of, there must be, I don't know, you'll have the numbers, the number of Chinese students studying in the UK. Do you think they should be individually vetted to make sure they're not working for the state?
No, I don't believe that, but I don't think that the Chinese state should be monitoring them when they're in this country. And it's clear that the Confucius Institutes have a communist-approved line on Chinese history. So that isn't up for debate. And there are allegations, which I very strongly suspect are substantive, that they are also being used to monitor Chinese students. So we should say to the Chinese, for example, on Confucius Institutes, you can have them as long as there is open discussion about China.
Let me take you away from Confucius for a second and look at other trading partners. What about TikTok? Would you like to go down the route that the lower house in the US went down and said, essentially, we should be banning TikTok?
Potentially, yeah. There are two issues with TikTok, and both of them are concerns. One of them is about information flow going back to China. And there is lots of reasons that China wants Western information, but effectively data and information now and in the future is power. And we just need to remember that if people are wondering why China wants our information. But secondly, if you look at the algorithm in TikTok, there is an algorithm used inside China, which encourages Chinese kids to be smart, to do puzzles, etc. And there's algorithms outside China, which is encouraging people to use TikTok. So effectively, TikTok's algorithms inside China are encouraging Chinese kids to be smart. TikTok's algorithms outside China are encouraging everyone else's kids to be dumb.
OK, well, wait a sec, Bob. It sounds very simple to you then. You should just be saying, We should be banning TikTok in the UK.
Well, either you say to the Chinese, you have one algorithm, or you have no information flow for this stuff back to China, and then potentially yes. Otherwise, we should be. Yeah. So look, if you want a simple answer, we need to be being much more robust in our approach to China. So actually, I support a lot of what the Americans are doing because I think they are wise and they are ahead of Europe and ahead of the UK on this as well.
Do you think China's willing to move? I mean, from everything you know about China, and I've, lived there and studied there and all the rest of it, do you see China as a compromising sort of partner?
Potentially not. But again, if you look at the way that the Australians have very robustly dealt with China, China still trades with Australia. They've said lots of angry words in public, but they've always accepted when the Australians have taken a really robust line. One of the things that we did a few years ago, myself, Ian Duncan Smith and others, is that we persuaded the government to get Huawei out of our 5G. We would not have done that without Australia's lead on this. And the Chinese Communist Party really kicked off about Australia's stance on Huawei. But effectively, there's a lot of angry words, but no change in policy and no quotes unquote punishment towards the Australians. So actually, if you take a very robust approach to China, I think they take a respectful approach back. And I think that is the approach that we now need, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's on Confucius Institutes, whether it's on about diversifying supply lines, which is really important, whether it's about mandating DNA inspections on cotton to make sure it doesn't come from Xinjiang, where it is made with forced labor or slave labor because of the oppression of Muslims by the Chinese state.
Do you think we'll notice any difference in this country in terms of our dealings with China in the coming 6 months, 1 year?
Not necessarily, because the whole point is if you encourage firms to diversify supply lines, they will go and diversify those supply lines now, and you will probably see very little difference in terms of trade where people get their cotton from. But if you say to companies very clearly, we're going to be doing DNA tests to make sure your cotton doesn't come from places where slave labor is used, you will be encouraging those corporations through economic threat of fine, through threat of breaking the law, but also through public shaming to make sure their supply lines are clean. If we did nothing about it and China then invades Taiwan and we take these measures, then you will see change, and potentially a very, very negative change, because if we are putting down sanctions on China the way we've tried to do so on Russia when it's invaded a rival territory, then you're going to see a collapse in the global economy.
What do you want to hear from Rishi Sunak?
That we need coherence in our dealings, and we're moving towards that. And I think Rishi gets that, and I think Oliver Dowden does as well. And we've been doing lots of incremental things. And it might be that we just continue doing these incremental things. So in the next year, next 2 years, whether it's us in government or Labour, then we get to a position where we have a more robust approach. I would like to see more of a big bang moment where we collectively, all government departments, look at how we can mandate higher standards to make sure that we take a more robust approach to China, which in the long term is good for our relationship with China, it's good for China, frankly, and is good for the world.
Bob Sealing, thanks very much. In a moment, we'll be looking at the Tavistock Clinic in London, the closure of the Gender Identity Development Service for kids and young adults there that will happen at the end of this week. And we'll be talking to the expert on the Tavistock, an author, Hannah Barnes.
At the end of this week, one of the most controversial medical institutions, is that the right word, centres, is going to close its door. It's at the Tavistock Clinic in northwest London, and it was the GIDS Centre, which is where people, teenagers, who had gender identity problems were given a medical treatment that would biologically sort of change their sex. 2,000 people went through this, and it was hugely controversial, based on not a whole lot of data. It was medical experimentation, and now they're closing the doors.
And the person who really got under the skin and tried to understand what was going on at the GIDS Centre of the Tavistock Clinic in London was Hannah Barnes, who wrote a book called Time to Think. And it was called Time to Think because this was the idea of a pause, that the puberty blockers that many young people, and they weren't just teenagers, actually, they were preteens as well, were put on, would give you that space to think about how or whether or why you would transition. And they found, with the limited data that came from this, because that was the extraordinary thing, so little data had actually been collected in this NHS institute. With the limited data they had, 100% of the children and young people that had been on the puberty blockers then went on to transition. And so Hannah started this work, and I think Hannah Barnes, who's with us now, the author, it was pretty much as a result of the work that you were doing with Deb Cohen at Newsnight that the GIDS department shut or announced it was shutting.
I think the work of Deb and I played a big part in it. I think it's more than that. You know, there were these very high-profile legal proceedings against the Tavistock Trust, which questioned whether children and young people could provide consent to puberty blockers. You know, we were only able to do that, and then I took it on further in the book because brave whistleblowers and former patients and parents were willing to speak to me. So I think it was lots of people were responsible, but I think we certainly brought awareness of what was going on at GIDS to a much broader audience because we were able to as national journalists, and we sparked the CQC going to inspect them and
the Quality Care Commission.
The Care Quality Commission, and which rated the service inadequate, and we helped push NHS England, I suppose, to starting this independent review, which we're going to get imminently.
And the terrifying thing for a lot of people now, a lot of children, a lot of young adults and parents, is that we've seen this closure coming down the channel, I mean, for the last 2 years or so. And it's happening this week, but there are kids who actually don't know where they're going now. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know who they should be referred to because this was the only NHS clinic in England.
Yes, so the BBC's reporting today that the current children under the care of GIDS have been pretty much left in the dark. I mean, it's an atrocious situation. I think we have to acknowledge that the people who have been let down so badly in all of this are those children and young people. First by being referred for a medical treatment for which really there was no robust evidence base. And then for many, many years, no one did anything. And the reason we're in such a mess now is, I would argue, that so many people did so little for so long. So we have young people, there's about 700 children and young people we're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds, under the care of GIDS. I reported last week that actually the majority of those will not be passed on to these new services, which are going to open immediately after. But the majority are going to go to a completely different service run by Nottinghamshire Healthcare Trust. Now, that had never been announced. Yeah. It's not in any public documentation from NHS England. We don't know what care they're going to get. And frankly, other news out today shows just how bad a state that trust is in. All of its CQC ratings have been suspended. That is such as the state of Nottinghamshire Healthcare Trust. So it seems a bizarre choice to put some very vulnerable young people. So we have about 250 going to these new services at Great Ormond Street, and there's another one up in the northwest of England. And no one is coming off that waiting list, right? So these young people have been desperately let down. There are 6,000 children waiting for care. Some of them have been on it for 5 years already, and no one is coming off because they can't staff these services. I mean, I found out Great Ormond Street are trying to incentivise people with £500 bonuses.
Wow. So they can't get the staff to do it. Why? Because isn't the expertise, or because there is so much controversy around it that no one wants to sort of grasp this live rail?
I think it's probably the latter. I mean, I'm aware that the current GIDS staff have not been successful in getting posts at the new services. Whatever expertise they had, it's not something that these new services seem to want. I think really it's who would want to work in this field. It's toxic. Anybody who talks about it is attacked. The clinicians who work in it are vulnerable. And I think you've got this other thing going on at the moment where they're not protected in case of accusations of conversion therapy.
Yeah, I want to quote you, Hannah, because I think it might clear up people who are sort of coming to this for the first time. You say, in the piece you just wrote for the New Statesman, this is not a story that denies transgender identities. This is not about railing against people who want to transition. It's not anti-trans, it's not transphobic, but it is a story about the underlying safety of an NHS service and the adequacy of the care it provides. Can you just elaborate on that for a bit more? Because some people might have missed the middle bit where they think, well, why would you try and stop children that need to transition from transitioning?
And it's never been about that. So what's happened here is quite extraordinary. A decade and a half ago, the Tavistock, or GIDS at the Tavistock, did the right thing. it saw this medical intervention, puberty blockers, was being used in other parts of Europe. It started off in the Netherlands. But there was very, very little data. What there was appeared to be promising, that when you had only a very small number of children who were very, very distressed around this perceived mismatch between how they felt, their gender identity, and their biological sex. And this approach had been pioneered in the Netherlands, which said if you had a child who had had this feeling since very, very early childhood, it then persisted through puberty, they had a really supportive, stable family environment, they had no other significant mental health difficulties, in all those circumstances, maybe this treatment would be very helpful to them to relieve this distress and give them this time to think. Now, so because the data was so few and not terribly robust, and that was acknowledged at the time, they set out to do their own research. Good thing to do. The extraordinary thing was that GIDS didn't wait for any of that data to come back before just rolling out this as clinical policy. And when they did get data back, by which point they'd placed hundreds more 14 and unders on puberty blockers, it said, actually, it doesn't appear to be helping them. And then they didn't stop.
So, Hannah, I mean, that is so alarming that kind of you're just doing these extraordinary drugs of puberty blocking when you haven't got any data that backs up whether it is of any use or not. Is it because the medics who work there, maybe well-meaning, were just trigger happy, or was there a sort of almost a kind of ideological aspect to this that may have been driving it?
I think it started out as absolutely well-meaning. I mean, no one questions how distraught some of these children and young people were. And here was a thing that appeared to help them. So, you know, why not do it? And there were lots of arguments that, you know, it wasn't neutral to withhold the treatment either. But it wasn't based on evidence. And actually the extraordinary thing about this story is that for many years, the leadership of the service were very open and honest about what they were doing. And so in 2015, both the head of the service, she's still head of the service, Polly Carmichael, and her effective number 2, they told Parliament, well, we've extended this. We don't just give puberty blockers to those for whom there is a bit of an evidence base that it works. We're now giving it to children in care, children with psychotic difficulties, and children, frankly, would have been ruled out. Not only, they just would not have been eligible for them. And they said, we feel that it would be the wrong thing to deny them this life-changing intervention. So it's feeling. This is feeling-based clinical activity. It was never evidence-based. And of course it was well-meaning, but ill-informed.
I find that so incredible that you would be doing something so fundamental that is going to shape a child's future for the rest of their lives on a gut feeling.
I mean, I guess the point is that in Holland, under those trials, it did work for a small number. Didn't? I mean, the puberty blockers were seen to be the right intervention for those children at that time. Is that right?
Well, it's a curious thing that's happens in this field. You know, a paper is published and the findings are actually quite weak. They're relatively cautious, not terribly robust. And then they become amplified over time as the gold standard. And actually those early Dutch papers said, I think they even described them as these are cautious initial findings. And yet over time they've become, wow, there's such a strong evidence base.
Because
there wasn't. I mean,
the drugs in the puberty blockers are actually drugs to treat completely different things like prostate cancer and endometriosis, right?
And they are used in children for one purpose only, which is when a child starts puberty really early, what we call precocious puberty. And the argument that some in the trans community make is this is transphobic because they're used in so-called cisgender children, but you're just denying them to trans children. But NHS England have made this point very, very clearly. They operate in a completely different way when used in precocious puberty. So first of all, the children are like 7. So it's a completely different stage of your development, your cognitive development, your identity development. You're on them for a very, very short period of time. But then most importantly, those children stop. They come off the blocker and they go through puberty. In this context, you're at the most important stage of a young person's development, puberty, for your cognitive development, for your sexual identity, for your gender identity, all parts of you, your acceleration of bone mineral density, and pretty much no one comes off. They don't go through their body's biological puberty. They mostly then go on to synthetic hormones, and the body changes accordingly.
You've spoken a lot about data in this. What is the data on the 2,000 people who have had puberty blockers about whether they feel that they are happy? I mean, has it worked for some people and not for others, or do we know?
Well, first of all, just to caveat the 2,000, that is my figure that I've come up with for this new edition of the book. I've done a new round of freedom of information requests. That figure has never been put in the public domain. So I have pieced together from published papers from GIDS and the endocrinologists at University College London hospitals, what they've put in the public domain, multiple FOIs that I have, that around 2,000. Sorry,
you've actually tried to get information.
That around, or a conservative figure would be about 2,000 since the start of this study have been referred for puberty blockers. Do we know what's happened to them? No. There has been no long-term follow-up or even any follow-up of those children. We know a little bit about 44 of them, which were the children that went on to the study initially that I mentioned. And all we know about them is that 43 went on to hormones. But there has been no effort to collect long-term data. It is difficult.
Does that surprise you?
Yes.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
It is astonishing.
But there has been a change in the law now, right? Which is that puberty blockers will not be given out by the NHS.
They're not going to be prescribed as routine practice anymore, no. The idea is that there is an attempt going on now to set up a research trial, because they've said we cannot keep doing that. That's not how medicine works. We can't give a treatment which the evidence reviews have all come to the same conclusion, whether it's here in England or in Sweden, in Finland, that there is so much uncertainty either way, with risks and benefits. But as for have they worked, there isn't agreement on what the purpose of the blocker is. Now, certainly I have spoken to people who say that blockers were life-saving for them. Yeah. And I don't question their experience at all. I've equally met and spoken with people for whom they've been really harmful, and transitioning was not the right decision for them, and the assessment process at GIDS was poor and inadequate and too shallow. But when we're dealing with a really strong drug, we have to have some proper data. And were it the case, Dr. Hilary Cass, who's leading this independent review, who will report very, very soon, but she said, were it the case that it was just affirming someone's gender identity, there'd be no difficulty. But we're prescribing really powerful drugs of which we don't know what the long-term consequences are. So that's why we have to do it properly.
I just wonder, I remember, I wasn't here, but when you last came on the podcast and you talked about how difficult it was to get the book published, and I think it was 23 publishers.
Yeah, 22.
Said no, 22, sorry. 23rd said yes. How difficult it was to get it published. It gets published. It's got a lot of attention. I wonder whether you sense that the climate is changing in terms of public opinion on this.
It's really difficult to tell. I think that there is an overwhelming but very silent majority who think trans people exist, they deserve to be treated with dignity and have access to good quality healthcare. But when it comes to children, and in this case very often very vulnerable children with many other difficulties, then we need to be careful and not rush this, and we just can't give out a treatment for which we don't know the long-term outcomes or if it might be harmful. So I do think that, but at the same time, every time I write about this, people shout at me, keyboard warriors shout at me, and anybody who does gets abused, and it's already apparent that there will be a backlash against the final CAS recommendations, and some people do not want to accept it. We have a hint of what she's going to say from the interim report. So I think it's going to be really messy. And I think it goes back to, we have let down so many children and young people, and part of the reason they're so distressed now is because we've allowed them to think for so long. The adults have allowed them to believe for so long that this is the only treatment that's going to take their pain away. And we've known for many, many years that that's not the case. It might be for some, but we need to conduct proper research. And, the adults left the room, and it's shameful, really.
Hannah Barnes, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to admit something, which was that I started playing a clip which I just assumed was a spoof, because it has this deep American voice warning you about the dangers.
The bogeyman is coming.
Yes. Well, we're going to play this to you. I thought it was a spoof, but apparently it isn't.
London, a city steeped in history. But tonight, its ancient streets bear witness to a different tale. A tale not of kings and queens, but of crime and desperation. It is a city now run by the Labour Party. Its police answer to them. It is a blueprint for how Labour intend to run the rest of the country, if you let them. In the depths of these narrow passageways tread squads of ULEZ enforcers dressed in black, faces covered with masks, terrorizing communities at the beck and call of their Labour mayor master, who's implemented attacks on driving, forcing people to stay inside or go underground. Gripped by the tendrils of rising crime, London citizens stay inside. The streets are quiet. Quieter at night now than they used to be. A 54% increase in knife crime since the Labour mayor seized power has the metropolis teetering on the brink.
This is a Conservative Party advert put out on the Conservative Party website and on their Twitter feed, and it's astonishing. Sadiq Khan, just for the record, love him or loathe him, did not seize power. He won 2 elections fairly and squarely. So,
But I've been hiding, haven't you, as a person of London?
Well,
Have you been hiding?
Well, Emily, you and I were out in London last night. Didn't seem to me the streets were empty. Didn't seem to me that the tube was empty going home. It didn't seem to me that people were cowering behind their curtains,
You know when
scared
you have
to go
small
out.
kids and you promise them a day out in like the London dungeon, that is the kind of voice, the voiceover that I would hope to hear if I had a 5 and a 7-year-old and we were doing a bank holiday trip to the London dungeon. I wouldn't have expected to hear the party of government adopting, I think we can say, an American Stephen King kind of horror voice for an advert.
What about British jobs for,
Well, yes.
British workers?
I think they've now
Well, couldn't
called
they
it-
got a British voiceover
Exactly.
artist?
Yeah, somebody who's equally horrified. Probably because they don't come out their houses.
I just thought that it's, come on, the London mayor who runs policing. Well, yeah, but also the Home Secretary has a bit of a say as well.
John Sopel is now auditioning for the next Conservative attack
I
ad.
want to be the voiceover artist for the next Conservative Party. Be scared. Be very, very scared and do have nightmares.
Yes. But they have now pulled it, haven't they?
No, they pulled one bit. Hang on. We've got to clarify one important bit. They showed a scene in the video of mayhem on the Underground.
Oh, yes.
Yeah? Except it wasn't the Underground. It was Penn Station, in New York.
Yeah. So a completely different city
So
in
they
a
just
completely
spliced
different
together any old
country,
video.
in a completely different continent.
Didn't check what it was. I mean, the whole thing, honestly, I suppose it has an effective, it's negative ad campaigning a la US style, but it was so amateur and so hammy and so ridiculous, honestly. Do better.
We don't think this was Susan Hall, the Tory candidate for mayor, do we?
Well, it wasn't her voiceover.
It definitely wasn't her voiceover, but someone had that great idea, which smacks of desperation.
We'll be back tomorrow. Bye.
You won't be. I'm on my own.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.